نرحب بالحضور الكريم في إطار فعاليات الجلسة الثالثة من اليوم الثالث من الندوة بعنوان تفكيك الاستعمار وإعادة الاعتبار للحقوق الوطنية، حيث تقدم كل من الدكتورة دانا الكرد ورقة بعنوان العودة إلى الحقوق الوطنية في الصراع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي، والدكتور
Francesco Amoruso will be talking to us. And the paper of his title, Undoing Settler Colonialism, Thoughts on Normalcy, Normalization, and the Politics of Recognition. And Dana El-Kurd will be talking to us. And the paper...
Sure. Okay.
The paper's title is Recentering National Rights
نرحب بالحضور الكريم في إطار فعاليات الجلسة الثالثة من اليوم الثالث.
Ladies and gentlemen, the third day of this symposium entitled Settler Colonialism and the Palestinian Struggle Against Zionism. Dr. Daniel Kurd will be presenting a paper entitled Recentering National Rights in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Mr. Francesco Amoruso will be talking to us about the undoing settler colonialism, thoughts on normalcy, normalization, and the politics of recognition. Settler colonialism changes the landscape of our very life, and the settlers take hegemony of the culture and the land. Like settler colonialism changes the narrative of history and goes back to the conventional laws when invasion has been one of the methods of conquest. Indeed, the right to self-determination is an entrenched right nowadays, and we can pose a legitimate question to deconstruct colonization or decolonization away from the one-state solution that marginalizes the struggle of the Palestinians, the legitimate struggle of the Palestinians to gain their right to self-determination. Dr. Dana will be tackling a very important issue that talks about the chaos of the terminology that distorts the essence of the Palestinian struggle. Dr. Dana believes that the settler colonialism and apartheid and their projection or manifestation and comparison with the Palestinian cause might be problematic. Dr. Dana works at the Richmond University, and she deals with authoritarianism, and the floor is yours. Please, 25 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ayah. I will be speaking in English. And Dana El-Kurd is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Richmond and senior fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, and the author of the book Polarized and
Alright, so today I'll be presenting on recentering national rights. And my main argument is essentially that the proposed solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict both on the right and the left. And it's decoupled the concept of national rights from the concept of sovereignty. And I argue that a practical as well as just solution will be impossible to achieve without reasserting the centrality of these rights. And I don't claim to have, one clear vision or one clear answer. I mean, I have ideas, but I wouldn't be so bold as to claim like this is exactly what should happen. But my argument is that, regardless of what we arrive at, once we center these rights in our discussions and our proposals, we'll be able to find solutions that are much less problematic and have more generative discussions. So just to quickly give a brief kind of definition of what I mean when I say Palestinian national rights, this is more than the collective rights that a group might have within a settler colonial state. So Dr. Bashara notes in his book on civil society that the notion of nationness in the Arab world, and I'm obviously translating here, goes beyond the territorial boundaries of a single state. So the term nation for Bashara refers to a group of people who possess a desire for sovereignty. And it's tied to this broader regional identity and nation. And he emphasizes across the Arab world that any possible democratic future will have to contend with this nation, this ummah, beyond the national identity of a specific state. And this is the case for the Palestinian context as well. And so when we come to the idea of sovereignty, kind of in a layman's terms kind of way, we understand that the state is sovereign. But how did the state become sovereign? So Habermas discusses how states transformed from feudal arrangements into nation-state configurations that we see today when they transformed from a nation of nobility to the Volksnation, the nation of the people. And this kind of non-nobility, the masses will no longer subjects but citizens. So this kind of transformation re-legitimized state authority as political actors no longer derived their authority from religious understandings or tradition, but via the authority of mass citizen buy-in. So this is why we see states make claims about being the true representatives of the people's will, even in authoritarian systems, because whether they're representing a particular ethnic group or whether they're presenting, shared values of some common citizenry, basically on civic grounds, the state is understood as an executor of the law enacted by the people who are sovereign. So this is kind of the shifting conception of our understanding of sovereignty here. And sovereignty in this scenario, and as we've come to understand it, is not just the ability of a state actor to impose its will upon a territory or rebuff external intervention, but also the ability of the people that consider themselves citizens of the state to exercise control over the territory and to have a say in its future. So it's no longer just this political legal concept or an institution of international relations. And it's for that reason that sometimes we can separate sovereignty from the state itself. For example, if the state examples in history when the state has become more technocratic or more removed, or as common citizens felt disengaged from the political process, we see a rise of populist movements or secessionist movements, these kinds of movements in which people claim popular sovereignty, divorced and separate from the state. So in cases where, such as in Palestine, and where there is only aspiration towards self-determination and representative government, groups can still claim sovereignty over a territory in the absence of a state, using this kind of idea of popular sovereignty. And they legitimize these claims, they legitimize their claims to the control of the territory and right to control the territory given their historical legacy or their continuity in the territory or their indigeneity. So aside from kind of classical conceptions of Westphalian sovereignty built on the idea of non-interference, indigenous people should also have two types of sovereignty, and I'll quote the definitions here. Domestic sovereignty, meaning the right to exercise effective control within the borders of the within the borders of the state, as well as interdependent sovereignty. So meaning the ability of people to regulate the flow of information, ideas, goods, people, or capital across the borders of the state. And I'm using Stephen Krasner's work on sovereignty from his 1999 book. So as I'll demonstrate in the coming slides, no political program or quote unquote solution around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has thus far emphasized the centrality of these rights adequately, and so have come to problematic conclusions. So beginning kind of with proposed solutions on the right, I'm basically referring to those who want Israel to control the entirety of historic Palestine. This culminated in the likes of Donald Trump or Jared Kushner, but obviously this vision has percolated for some time. But the idea is, the approach to Palestinian statehood and sovereignty in this vision is basically to deny them altogether and to advocate for a continuation of the status quo in the sense that it's a highly controlled self-governance, quote unquote, in severely surveilled pockets of territory, and a solution basically that fulfills none of the previously mentioned conditions of sovereignty. And this is basically a vision of a state in name only, where sovereignty is approximated with limited self-governance. And so the Kushner plan, the Peace to Prosperity plan, literally discusses the term sovereignty and calls it an obstacle to more pragmatic and operational concerns. So on the left, solutions from the left have more understandably been concerned about Palestinian living conditions. And it's for this reason we see kind of a turn to a rights-based approach in Western circles, liberal or left circles, basically rather than continuing to advocate for Palestinians within a framework of statehood, especially, given the limitations of that framework. The rights-based approach argues that, sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. So the rights-based approach instead advocates for, quote, a full equality and enfranchisement within the current political system that governs everyone from the river to the sea, so within the state of Israel. And this comes after years of advocacy within Israel from Palestinian leaders, as well as in international movements such as BDS. But these frameworks also forego a discussion of a long-term solution to the conflict. Instead, activists are focused on penalizing Israel kind of in the now until certain demands are met regarding, the occupation and citizenship of Palestinian citizens of Israel, etc. So these rights-based approaches are not incompatible with frameworks that might promote or uphold Palestinian national rights, but they don't make any claims to long-term solutions. And this kind of vein of framework, or this vein of advocacy, comes in conjunction with the popularization of the apartheid term, which again privileges a discussion of Palestinian rights and freedoms, to express themselves without fear of repression, to remain in their homes, not face discrimination, etc. And obviously, the natural conclusion to ending apartheid is the creation of a system in which Palestinians are also extended equal rights and citizenship. So some people have started calling this like a change in regime, though again, activists differ on what that system would entail. But overall, much of this kind of this vein of binationalism, in any case, doesn't really provide structural solutions to the legacies of colonization, and for that reason, I would argue that there's been a significant pushback against this kind of framework, because some argue that a solution in which Palestinians are extended citizenship by Israel falls into this kind of liberal notion of rights that gives the impression the lack of rights currently extended to Palestinians is just a deficiency rather than a feature of the system. And so there is this fear that the Palestinian issue in this kind of framework will be reduced to a solution that only upholds individual rights and says nothing about national rights. Now, in a kind of different vein of binationalism, there is this emphasis on indigeneity in conjunction with national rights. So as we all know, Dr. Azmi's contribution to the Palestinian struggle within Israel, made great strides, and I would argue was instrumental in increasing the national awareness of Palestinian citizens of Israel. But more recently, with the decline in that movement, binationalism on these terms has also been challenged. So in this slide, I'm referring to a paper by Dr. Ilan Pape in 2018 called Indigeneity as Resistance, in which he discusses this kind of indigeneity still functioning within the binational framework, and talks about how that kind of framework relies heavily on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is a declaration that literally states that nothing it advocates for would, quote, dismember or impair the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. So it's again talking about indigenous accommodation within existing states. And that leads Pape to describe the Palestinian strategy in Israel as, quote, never been about gaining sovereignty, that it is, quote, an incremental political struggle that can achieve partial achievements without being outwardly nationalistic, and that it can be a part of a larger campaign, but for now avoids the macro level political and ideological projects. So this form of indigeneity within kind of a binationalist framework, I think goes against or goes in the opposite direction of Dr. Azmi's original conception of this, and can be a dilution of the struggle in some sense. So there's kind of a review of the different kinds of forms of cultural resistance in this chapter, and some would argue and have argued that these amount to piecemeal actions that don't really pose a serious challenge to the state, and they are strategies of survival rather than victory. And it's probably why this kind of framework is losing traction with Palestinian citizens of Israel, and why we see less engagement with kind of official or organized civil society, and especially amongst the youth, a rejection of this kind of politics. Thirdly, there is kind of the post-colonial solution that's been proposed. I mean, we heard from Dr. Mahmoud Mamdani in this symposium, so I won't necessarily get into like a complete summary here. But the idea is that in this kind of scenario, a single democratic state without nations is the path that's advocated for. And again, the premise of this is that by doing so, you remove the existential threat that both communities face in a scenario of continuing nationalism. So you reject the ideas of the permanent majority and minority. So essentially a denationalized solution. And there are a couple of problems with this with this premise. One, kind of the main obvious one is that it equates settlers and colonizers. The quote from Dr. Mamdani's book is that it basically says that both are victims of modernity. But as Mizrahi scholar Ayah Randall writes, post-colonial frameworks basically say that there is, quote, no clear domination, and so call for no clear opposition. And you can see why this can be so dangerous in a situation where one group, the Palestinians, currently right now face an existential threat. And the second problem with this solution is that it de-emphasizes the Palestinian connection to the rest of the region. It doesn't really account for it at all. And maybe the most pressing issue is that it dismisses national aspirations and the reality of public opinion of both groups, both Israelis and Palestinians. So we know from public opinion polling that Israelis are, very concerned about a demographic threat, and they're increasingly trading in the vestiges of their democratic institutions for the sake of preserving their dominance. And public opinion polling on the Palestinian side also shows that most Palestinians still want a state that represents them with their national identity at its core. The support for a one-state solution, however broadly defined, is quite low. And we also saw this play out in the recent unity intifada. Palestinians living under all forms of Israeli rule, whether they carried citizenship or not, rejected traditional politics and insisted on asserting their national identity. I mean, some of the campaigns that activists worked on was literally, if you translate the objectives that they were talking about in Arabic, it's literally about raising a national consciousness. So it doesn't hold up to the reality of what people actually want. And finally, it holds up poor models as the kind of evidence that such a solution could come to pass. So South Africa is often used as a model because it's this self-described rainbow nation after apartheid. But the reality is that a lot of, I think, political science literature has corroborated that the South African model has been essentially a failure, and that the inequality is more exacerbated than ever. So as outlined in the book, The Black and White Rainbow by Caroline Holmes, she shows how the kind of moving beyond these identities and moving beyond nationalist identities has not worked in the South African case, and that 72% of individually held land remains in white hands. And at no stage since 1994 has the budget for land reform, for example, exceeded 2% of the national budget. So there's not even a comprehensive plan for kind of undoing or rectifying the issues of settler colonialism in the present day. So returning to Ayah Randall, she writes that the problem is that the term post-colonial carries with it the implication that colonialism is now a matter of the past, undermining colonialism's economic, political, and cultural deformative traces in the present. So calling for this kind of solution moves forward without rectifying the sins of the state's creation, and so only cements and reinforces systems of inequality. And so I think it's no wonder that South Africa, which has had a poor track record of resolving these issues or addressing past injustices, is held up as a model, because I think it's a blind spot of post-colonialism generally. And also more understandable that these kinds of solutions don't have much traction with the vast majority of the Palestinian public. Oh, sorry, this is what I was talking about now. So finally, I'll come to the decolonization framework, stemming kind of from settler colonial studies. Again, I'm a political scientist, but this is my reading of this vein of literature, is that this is basically the only framework that emphasizes sovereignty and control of land. And in this framework, they reject kind of binationalism approaches, because binationalism is essentially accepting the settlers' claim to the land or assimilation by another name. So what the framework of decolonization entails hasn't necessarily been fully worked out, but I would argue that settler colonial studies leaves many questions unanswered. First is that settler colonialism is conceived of structurally, at least in my reading of some of this literature. And in the case of Israel, it's often described as a state that pursues an inherent logic of domination. And this is a valid starting point, but it does little to explain how identities might shift and whether agency plays any role in transforming this kind of system. So settler colonialism, we understand is not static, as Dr. Ayah was saying at the start of this, is, many scholars have pointed out, it's not a single point in time or act of violence such as the Nakba, but an ongoing process. But does this also entail that the process has to be unidirectional? Is the only endpoint of settler colonialism truly total annihilation or total victory? And so, if if that really is the case, how do we explain away the, for example, growing trend of Mizrahi activists who are reimagining their identities and their future relationships to the region? Or how do we understand kind of the non-linear history of Jewish migration to Palestine? One Israeli historian, Gur al-Rawi, shows that Jewish settlement was often not even reacting to Zionist ideology, but was rather as a result of, you know, the pogroms in Europe. And sometimes was even actively discouraged by Zionist leadership. So while we know that one vision of the state won out, you know, an ethno-national state that we currently are engaging with, where does human agency play a part in shaping the future of the state? And secondly, people who rely on the decolonization framework will often make comparisons between Israel and other settler colonial states, and this is legitimate, but at some point these comparisons can be a little bit obfuscating. You know, there are historical specificities, and the Israel-Palestine case is not the Native Americans, it's not, you know, French Algeria. And as Dr. Bashar in his forthcoming book, in the English book, makes clear, this is not a solution. The Israel-Palestine situation is not a situation in which the Israeli colonizer has a motherland to return to. And so when examples of decolonization are used in other places, the few examples, you know, that exist, they're usually presented in a historically inaccurate way. So they gloss over the fact that sometimes decolonization preceded somewhat accidentally. For example, in French Algeria with the fleeing of the Pied Noir population. And the reality is that in the case of Palestine, a separate nation has been formed in the form of Israel, and identities have solidified. And some Israelis have now lived in this territory for a few generations. So a decolonization framework, while hazy on the details, you know, rejects a two-state solution as, you know, rightly an injustice, but also sees a binational solution as equally problematic. And it leads its adherents to demands of basically self-deportation of the settler community or removal of the settler by any means necessary. And I think that these kinds of demands can seem fatalistic and don't really reflect the historical specificity of the case. And importantly, this framework is also impractical because it doesn't really reflect the reality of the power dynamic that exists currently. So, you know, one side has much more power than the other side. One side has the capacity for violence and destruction much more than the other side. So framing decolonization in these terms makes a possible solution more and more unattainable in the case of Palestine and makes the issue more indivisible. From the kind of political science, international relations perspective, when we try to understand causes of war, IR 101, there's a concept in international relations called the indivisibility of an issue. So this is a situation where two sides go to war because there is no bargaining space. And that's where the decolonization framework seems to fit in. It's that Israel-Palestine or the future of Palestine, of historic Palestine, is an indivisible issue. But there is this other theory in international relations by scholar Robert Powell who argues that actually there is nothing that is truly indivisible. Bargaining indivisibilities should really be seen as issues of commitment. So there's always bargaining space to be found. It's just that one side cannot commit to an agreement given the imbalance of power. And this is an issue I think that the decolonization framework, while centering the right principles, does not resolve because it actually might exacerbate these commitment problems. So yeah, that's basically why I believe it's a little bit problematic and might be bad strategy. So just to kind of conclude and bring it back to the original argument of national rights, how do we envision a reality beyond this point? If all solutions that have been proposed, except kind of the decolonization framework, don't center Palestinian national rights? And how can we articulate, in that sense, decolonization without reducing indigenous sovereignty claims, or in the case of some, hoping for extreme outcomes that are never likely to pass? These are big questions, and I don't claim to have necessarily a concise answer for them. But if we take Palestinian national rights and the right to sovereignty as key principles, then we can start to formulate less problematic solutions. So putting national rights at the center means we can think of, you know, kind of reimagining new forms of citizenship, not as a form of assimilation and domination as it has served up to this point, but as something else. In the case of Palestine, where there are Palestinian refugee communities across a number of countries at this point, with also ties to a larger Arab nation, citizenship, we can imagine, will be a regional rather than a national arrangement. And we can, start to think of non-traditional forms of citizenship. So in this reimagining, we can center, for example, Palestinian refugee communities and think of the ways they will exercise sovereignty over historic Palestine and move freely as part of a decision-making, move freely in the territory as well as be part of a decision-making process pertaining to the future of the state. Such an approach would de-link Palestinian sovereignty from the defined borders of the state, emphasizing the sovereignty of the people themselves and stressing the fluidity of the indigenous people across territories conceived of in a Westphalian sense, both in the spaces they occupy and within their identities. And secondly, putting Palestinian national rights at the top of our priorities also means thinking of ways to shift control of the land decisively to the indigenous population, which would reconfigure the skewed balance of power that currently exists between the two groups. It would mean going beyond these kinds of assimilationist binational solutions and specify the forms of reparations that need to take place and change realities on the ground. And it doesn't necessitate a solution where a large group of people, agree to leave or magically disappear. And this is not to suggest, obviously, ignoring the historical reality of ethnic cleansing that was committed and continues to be committed by Israel, or to make false equivalences between settlers and natives, or to propose any solution which ignores nationalist claims. But to move beyond this kind of seeming inevitability of settler colonialism, we kind of have to exploit the gray zones of identity and agency, which might make it possible in the long term, for example, that Israelis reconceive themselves of their identities and their role in the region and their ties to their neighbors. So centering Palestinian rights while being a little bit more coherent about our demands in this way allows for this exercise of agency and ingenuity and ultimately hope. And yeah, everything I said, I think will seem a little bit far-fetched to some folks, but I would argue that it's still, this kind of reimagining is still more plausible than any framework for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that ignores the realities of nationalist claims or only ends in the annihilation of the people. So thank you very much for listening this morning or this afternoon in Doha, and I look forward to your questions.
شكرا دكتورة دانا, just right on time. شكرا. على الجانب الآخر تتناول ورقة الدكتور فرانشيسكو أمروزو مسألة هيمنة الاستعمار الاستيطاني على مظاهر الحياة العادية لدى كل من الفلسطينيين والإسرائيليين.
Colonialism talks on normalcy, normalization, and the politics of recognition. And as impact of the changes since the 90s, we find many examples. The Zionist movement has managed to create a normal social life for the Israelis at the local and international level. The paper also will be dealing with other aspects. Dr. Amoruso got his PhD from Exeter University and his MA in Middle East and Islamic Studies. He also analyzed the new Palestinian city of Rawabi. His research interests focuses on self-determination, justice, sovereignty, and other aspects of Palestinian struggles. You have 20 minutes, please, to present your paper. Shukran jazeelan.
I must begin by saying that I'm incredibly grateful for being here. And I would like to also extend my thank you to the organizers. And this paper that I'm going to present today is part of my PhD, or comes from my PhD research. So I think it's important to also acknowledge the role that Ilan and Lorenzo have played in helping me think through these ideas as supervisor and as an examiner in my Viva. This paper is still a work in progress in some ways, so I highly welcome any feedback and comments as well as questions. Before I start sort of reading from my paper, I would also like to try and contextualize it within these incredibly important conversations that have been taking place in the last couple of days, and to try and connect it to some of the themes that others have highlighted. In particular, I think one important aspect that's emerged in the way we think about settler colonialism is the role of agency and transformation. This was, of course, highlighted by Professor Ruhana in his talk, and in the paper by Mariam Hawari and Hani Awad, who really did a great effort in trying to really conceptualize the relationship between agency and governance, but also by Dana's wonderful talk just now. I think there are two assumptions about agency that we should be careful about. And one is that often agency is equated with resistance or with transformation, but sometimes agency is about maintaining the status quo and producing and reproducing existing structures. And also to be very mindful of the risks of understanding agency in the singular. So I would try in my research to think about plurality of agency and what is whose agency. Is there a one Palestinian agency? I would argue that there isn't. So these are things that I would like to keep in mind. So yeah, in my own work, I guess, well, this plurality of agency can be temporal, as Mariam and Hani have highlighted. It can be geographical. It can reflect the fragmentation of Palestinians in different constituencies. In my own work, this plurality is structured along class lines, but that's by no means the only way to look at it. So as Ayah has mentioned, my research was conducted in Rawabi, which I think is clearly a project that has a crucial class component to it. So that's probably why I've come to this conclusion. Two main ideas guide my research and will guide my presentation. These are class and recognition, which I think that when we think about in colonial contexts, of course, Frantz Fanon is our indispensable guide. For Fanon, recognition relates to the psychoaffective dimension of colonialism and serves as a warning against reproducing colonial logics. And related to this is the role, of course, of colonized bourgeoisies in perpetrating colonial injustice and capitalist injustice. I won't go into class too much in this paper, in this presentation, because of a lack of time. But I would just like to point out that recognition and class are to be considered strictly related. So this paper, as I mentioned, builds on ethnographic fieldwork that I conducted in 2018 in the city of Rawabi, and on recent indigenous critiques to the politics of recognition in settler colonial contexts, to locate some of the crucial mechanisms that produce political normalization in the context of Palestinian-Israeli relations. The paper investigates the hegemonic work of settler colonialism in the transformation of a core tenet of Palestinian nationalism, what Salim Tamari defined as a yearning for normalcy, into acceptance of the colonial status quo. In other words, it asks when and how the quest for a return to normal life turns into normalization. When and how a yearning premised on undoing the abnormal reality created by settler colonialism results in entrenching the social structure into the lived reality of Palestinians. My interviews with residents and officials in Rawabi, as well as architects and planners and engineers and activists as well, sort of will inform my analysis. The city of Rawabi was ideated by Palestinian businessman Bashar al-Masri. Its construction began in 2009. Rawabi is the first so-called new city to be built in Palestine. Indeed, it is the first Palestinian urban space since Zionism to be built that is not a refugee camp. Located between Ramallah and Nablus in the West Bank, Rawabi markets itself as an affordable housing project, promising a peaceful, clean, green, and comfortable lifestyle to young professional Palestinian families who are the kind of target demographic. Notably, Rawabi is also portrayed by its developers and supporters within the Palestinian establishment as a project of national significance to the Palestinian struggle for statehood and self-determination. Rawabi can be seen, indeed, as a Palestinian fact on the ground. It saves, the narrative goes, a native Palestinian hilltop from the potential expansion of the Ataret settlement, which is located just about a mile away. The picture is, however, far more complex than this. Rawabi is part of the PA agenda of building the state under occupation, while being denounced by the BDS movement and other Palestinian organizations as a normalization project. It reproduces colonial practices not only in its planning, different aspects of it. It's on a hilltop, it's planned, it draws inspiration for the Modi'in settlement itself, and so on, but also in the potentially displacing impact on the surrounding communities and in the dispossessing modalities of land acquisition. Rawabi is also premised on the production of tabula rasa, an empty canvas, itself a colonial invention, in at least two senses. One has to do with its architecture and urban form, which demonstrates disregard for its context and the adoption of colonial planning methods, and the other has to do with its foundational character, its desire to establish a new urban polity as a way of resolving the contradictions arising from economic development under settler colonial occupation. What clearly emerged from my fieldwork and interviews is that Rawabi is a hugely divisive topic within Palestinian public discourse, and this polarization, as I will argue in this paper, reveals a more fundamental tension between normalcy and normalization within Palestinian socio-political praxis. So first, I'm going to briefly explain what I mean by recognition and the politics of recognition in general and in the Palestinian context. Then I will offer some thoughts on normalcy and normalization on the basis of my experience in Rawabi. Recognition and the politics of recognition are two distinct but related concepts. On a theoretical level, recognition is to be traced back to Hegel's theory of the subject in Phenomenology of Spirit. I won't go too much into detail with this, but the idea is that subjectivity is formed through the mutual acknowledgement or exchange of recognition between two consciousnesses. This is exemplified by Hegel in the master-slave dialectic, where the master gets recognition by the slave, and so becomes a subject, and the slave gets from the master fear, which for Hegel is the beginning of wisdom, the internalization of the master's consciousness, so discipline, and finally work. When the slave overcomes fear and rejects obedience, he can, through the engagement with the objects in the world that he enters in contact with through his work, realize his self-consciousness and become a subject himself. Fanon didn't need to move very far beyond Hegel's dialectic to argue that colonial relations do not, in fact, allow for an emancipatory dialectic of recognition. For Fanon, the internalization of the consciousness of the colonizer must be broken by destroying the settler, by destroying the settler's consciousness. Hence, his interests in the negritude movement, his writing on violence, etc. These are all means towards the same end. Fanon hence refutes the notion that recognition offers an emancipatory strategy to the colonized. A politics of recognition is a politics based on the assumption that if injustice is caused by a lack of recognition, then justice can simply be achieved by recognizing the worth of groups who experience misrecognition or a lack of recognition, typically by the state. We find enthusiasm for the politics of recognition in continental political theory with Axel Honneth, in the North American liberal tradition with Charles Taylor, and in the policies of liberal multicultural settler states. I employ the term politics of recognition to describe a logic of articulation of settler-indigenous relations based on the assumption that settler states can address the historical wrongs of colonization by recognizing the cultural autonomy and distinctiveness of indigenous nations, and that conversely, indigenous nations can successfully obtain such recognition and through it regain sovereign power in their ancestral homelands. First Nation scholars in Canada have convincingly argued that recognition has replaced violence as the main mechanism for the dispossession and elimination of Indigenous nations. Recognition in Canada is a two-way process. First Nation nations have been asking and offering recognition, the state has granted and accepted recognition. My argument concerning Palestine is that a strategy of recognition has been in the making since Oslo, at least, as recognition was the necessary condition for the integration of Israeli capital in the region's markets and for the political pacification and stabilization that the peace process granted to the Israeli state. Recognition is, in this sense, a class project. It has allowed for processes of class formation described by Adam Haniyeh as a result of the Oslo Accords and for the emergence of crony capitalism in the Palestinian Authority, as Tariq Dana has argued. My other argument concerning Palestine is that Rawabi constitutes a private sector initiative, although in partnership with the PA, that compels us to seriously consider the political role played by corporate actors in the void left by a Palestinian national movement that is extremely weak at the moment, and according to some, possibly non-existent at the moment. In the second part of this presentation, I want to think further about the relationship between Rawabi and Palestinian nationalism through an engagement with the concepts of normalcy and normalization. Palestinians have often described the impact of Zionism, of Zionist settler colonialism, as a destruction of Palestinian social life and as the perpetual denial of its realization. Palestinian society did not cease to exist after 1948, of course. Fragmented, displaced, and colonized, Palestinians rebuilt the conditions for political and communal life under the new reality of settler colonialism. What was lost with the Nakba was not life itself, but the possibility of a normal life. As Ahmad Saadi has explained, and I'm quoting, a Nakba was the moment in history when Palestinians' world order, which had been considered part of the laws of nature, was violently and dramatically altered. Their legal rights were greatly diminished or obliterated altogether. Their cultural and physical environment underwent a dramatic transformation, and their existence as a national community ceased to be taken for granted. Due to the temporal incision of the Nakba, of course, the notion of normal life is inextricably tied to a relationship with the past, informed by feelings of nostalgia and return. In this account of the recurrence of the yearning for normal life in Palestinian cultural and intellectual production and collective consciousness, Salim Tamari stresses that for Palestinians, normalcy and normalization are two distinct and diametrically opposed concepts. Tamari explains that the struggle to be normal often implied an anti-normalization stance, and that living a normal life was seen as the sine qua non for resisting Israeli rule, end of quote. If in Palestinian socio-political praxis the two concepts are expressed as polar opposites, normalcy and normalization are in fact structurally related. I find this passage from the PACB document on normalization quite illuminating. The PACB document, PACB is the committee against, for the cultural and academic boycott of Israel. It is helpful to think of normalization as a colonization of the mind, this Fanon again, whereby the oppressed subject comes to believe that the oppressor's reality is the only normal reality that must be subscribed to, and that the oppression is a fact of life that must be coped with. Those who engage in normalization either ignore this oppression or accept it as a status quo that can be lived in. Understanding and subverting the structural relation is paramount to attempting to disrupt the normalizing work of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism, as illustrated by in Katie and Netanel's work, is sustained by the myriad mundane social practices of settlers. Zionism itself was founded to provide the realization for the quest for Jewish normal life in opposition to revolutionary and assimilationist frameworks. From the point of view of the survival of Zionist settler colonialism and its product, the Israeli state, Badarin argues that the politics of recognition provide a strategy of stabilization. Such strategy attempts, in my view, to resolve the contradiction between normalcy and the abnormality of a European settler colony in the Arab region, established and reproduced through colonial violence and dispossession. The pursuit of a normal, joyous life is, according to Richter Devereux, central to practices of sumud, of steadfastness by Palestinian women in particular, who configure it through everyday acts of defiance and construe it as a means of resistance. Steadfastness and anchoring to the land and to collective social and cultural practices are crucial to resisting settler colonialism in Palestine and elsewhere. Emphasis on everyday or unintentional resistance should not, however, limit a critical evaluation of the ideological infrastructure that shapes the meanings and goals attributed to the pursuit of normalcy by different actors. The point is not, and I want to make this extremely clear, to question or deny the legitimacy of rightful aspirations to normal life. The point is that recognition, which I have previously defined, inevitably produces political normalization. Residents of Rawabi, like Hamad, a lawyer from Abu Dis, tell me that they have moved to Rawabi to escape the everyday violence of Israel's occupation. In this sense, there is, Rawabi is perceived to be outside of that reality. To allow their children to grow up in a safer environment, and as middle-class professional or business people, Rawabi's residents can afford to find their normal life. It's not a collective normal life. It's a nuclear family life in this new city. Whereas for Masri, it is a matter of national pride and statehood in line with the Fayyadist strategy of establishing institutional facts on the ground, which would spearhead international recognition and eventually materialized somehow a Palestinian state. To conclude, Rawabi is a project of production of new forms of subjectivity. This has been already noted by others who've written on the topic and who've observed that Rawabi is the epitome of this kind of neoliberal logic that marries the disciplinary power of the soldier and the persuasive power of capitalism to produce a new Palestinian subjectivity that seeks to maintain the status quo rather than resist it. This paper has attempted to investigate more in depth the process of formation of said subjectivity, locating it at the intersection of normalcy and normalization, and explaining it as the outcome of the impossible recognition between colonizer and colonized. Another conclusion that can be drawn is about the importance of considering class formation and class struggle in the way we think about indigenous agency within settler colonial structures, but I think I will end here to allow some time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amoruso. نفتح الآن الباب للمداخلات.
We will open the floor for receiving your questions. Any questions to Dr. Dana first? Any questions to Dr. Amoruso? Microphone, please.
An Italian working on curriculum.
That's right. Thank you for that paper. I wonder if you might comment. There's some work, and I'm thinking particularly of an article by Allah Alazada and Rane Duda on a sort of neoliberal mentality in Ramallah itself anyway, a kind of cosmopolitanism, and I think it's something they describe or coin as a kind of, cafe culture there, which is already insisting on a kind of normal life, or this idea that Ramallah is a bubble. And I wonder if you might comment on how Rawabi is doing something further to what is already occurring in Ramallah.
Should I go ahead and reply? Thank you, Michaela.
نعم شكرا ميكائيلا.
I think that the main difference, of course, the two cities are related in many ways. Rawabi is in a way a continuation of what Ramallah has become in the last few decades. But I think there's also something fundamentally different between the two, and that difference is that I mentioned earlier that Rawabi is perceived to be on the outside. So there is, again, some form of displacing certain issues. Ramallah is riddled with contradictions, right? That cafe culture coexists with a lot of other stuff, right? Ramallah has refugee camps. Ramallah has resisted in many different ways, both the PA's neoliberalism and Israeli occupation. Ramallah is clearly besieged in so many ways. Rawabi, to me, represents an attempt to resolve those contradictions through a movement somewhere else. So in that sense, they are both kind of there's continuity, but there's also a rupture between the two experiences.
هل هناك مداخلات أسئلة؟ تفضل أستاذ دكتور هاني.
Thank you, Francesco, for your very important and fascinating, actually, talk. And I have a question. It could be simple, but what makes a difference between, like, Rawabi as like a city and any gated, community in I know Rawabi is in the West Bank. West Bank is like in a geography where settler colonial project is functioning. But what makes it difference between new different modes of urbanism that already taking place in other settings, whether in the West Bank or any other areas?
Thank you, Hani. I don't think it's particularly different in the sense that it is the product of a global trend, right? Rawabi didn't invent anything, right? If anything, they're emulating lots of different experiences and primarily Israeli settlements, right? There was a field trip organized for the planners of Rawabi to Modi'in. Like it was there's an actual connection there, right? There are Israeli architects in advisory capacity to the construction project. So of course Rawabi imitates, and I think that the main difference between Rawabi and say other new developments in I don't know, like the diplomatic quarter in Ramallah or other kind of similar housing projects is that Rawabi is a city. The other ones are neighborhoods, they're residential kind of, but they don't have the same idea of themselves as really founding something new, something different. Rawabi's kind of also, let's say, PR is very different, right? Masri gives interviews to international newspapers and so on and so forth every day. There's a lot of attention and spotlight on it, and the forms of land acquisitions, I think, like Rawabi had to be. There was special planning regulations issued specifically for Rawabi. There was a decree, a presidential decree by Mahmoud Abbas that made Rawabi a project of national significance so that the lands of those belonging to people who didn't want to sell could be expropriated. So there's a huge amount of difference between Rawabi and these other kind of smaller projects in that sense.
Thank you. Professor Double, please.
Thank you very much. I must say I thought this was two absolutely superb presentations. Thank you. Thank you for two superb presentations. Just great clarity and really makes me think. And I don't have any conclusions, but I do have just an observation. I'm afraid it's going to be a South African one, and I wonder whether, I'll put it as a statement, but it's really a question, it's an open question. And that is that in the height of the anti-apartheid movement, specifically towards sport, but more generalizable, there was a phrase which said, no normal sport in an abnormal society. But it was more general because it was part of a politics of refusal, a politics of negation. In the immediate post, or the early post-apartheid period, just as when the glow of Mandela was fading, when South Africa was beginning to fail as the new Jerusalem on the hill, the plea from many people was to say, why can't we be a normal, abnormal society? In other words, lower expectations and get on with making a new society. And I wonder whether you think that there's that trajectory, which has its own promise, is anyway in sight.
Trajectory of what exactly? Sorry. Trajectory of what exactly?
The trajectory of having unrealistic expectations to one of an acceptance of the politics of making a new society.
I feel like, thank you, first of all, for your question. I think this could also be a question for Dana, who I think left, though.
It is a question to both of you.
Yes.
Yeah. Has she left?
Sorry,
No,
my
here.
video was
Okay,
off.
great.
Hello,
do you wanna,
everybody. Yes.
Do you want to go first? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the point of the kind of open question is to say that, like, you know, we kind of have to deal with the reality as it exists. But I do think that, you know, dealing with reality can veer quite quickly and insidiously into allowing for perpetuation of you know, in unjust dynamics. So I think my approach, and you know, I don't come at this by myself, you know, Dr. Bashara's forthcoming work also talks about this at some length. Like, the idea is to accept certain facts on the ground, given kind of the existence of the Israeli nation, but to allow some level of imagination to be able to kind of push for a reality that may not be as materially visible in the now. I don't know if I'm making much sense here, but essentially my critique of the decolonization framework is exactly that: is that it's taking too many extremes in what it can envision, but that doesn't mean I think that we should, you know, completely forego that kind of imagination process and to kind of rethink some of our underlying assumptions. And yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm happy to continue having this conversation.
Okay. Dr. Amoruso?
Yeah, from my point of view, I guess all I can say is that these are political conversations that need to take place in the appropriate space, and I don't think I belong in that space. I'm here to point to possible dangers and to analyze the present, but also to think about the possible dangers of, for example, a one state that doesn't that is not based on what Dan has been talking about on Palestinian collective rights, and yeah, beyond that, I don't know what's going to happen.
Okay. All right. Okay. Professor Mahmoud. It's you. Thank you. Yeah, microphone. Yep. Coming in the way.
Yeah, this question is for you. Thank you very much. It's a fascinating presentation on a subject I don't know much about. So it strikes me that there's a two-sidedness to the phenomenon you're talking about. One is the side you're talking about, which is dealing with reality. The other side, which I'm more interested in, is making a reality while dealing with it, changing it. And I think this other side has something to do with what you talked about in your presentation, but you said you will not really talk about it, which is Rawabi as a class project. It's making a particular reality, not a national reality, a reality from the perspective and point of view of a particular part of the nation. I'm interested in hearing more about that because it doesn't just accommodate and normalize a situation. It wants to change it further in the direction of a normal it imagines. It's that creative element, that thing which you call agency.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I absolutely agree. That work of imagination is being done. It's being done by people who can exercise hegemony within society. So the question is how to challenge that, and how to challenge that within a process of reconstructing a national movement. Should the two things be done at the same time? Probably yes. I would say yes. This isn't, I guess I'm not saying anything new, at least to Palestinians, right? Like Palestinian Marxist organizations have been grappling with the question of how to build strategic alliances on the basis of an analysis of the class composition of their own society and of the settler society as well. These efforts have been lost, I guess, for a while. Maybe it's time to, not go back to old analysis, but to go back to that kind of methodology. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yes. تفضل.
شكرا. Hello. I'd like to touch upon the title first. I think that the life in Rawabi is an exemption. It is not nothing to do with normalcy, because there are discrepancies between the system itself in the Rawabi. So I think that life in the Rawabi is abnormal. It is an exemption. Second, it is an economic project rather than a liberation-related national project. You've seen Rawabi and you know Rawabi, so I think that the geography of Rawabi is also different than the villages surrounding it. I imagine that if this project had not been economic, no one could have been able to build a house in there because it is adjacent to the most militarized settlement. And in addition to the nature of the roads, the Atara checkpoint, as you know, we were not able to go through it without inspection. And if the Atara checkpoint is closed, then a subsidiary kind of road would open due to certain abnormalities that took place between the Israeli authorities and the Rawabi, those who take care of the Rawabi. I live in Birzeit and I know the area by heart. And if I want to talk about your paper, I think Francesco talked about the silver lining rather than the dark side. He talked about the metropole, globalized kind of Rawabi that has entertainment facilities and so on and so forth, and every Palestinian loves to live in. So it reflects the elite. I, as Ibrahim, cannot live in the Rawabi. I cannot live there because it's extremely expensive. And I cannot buy a house. I cannot rent a house there. So I think that you should have perhaps focused in your paper on the dark side as well, and the bigger picture of the establishment of Rawabi in the first place. Yes. I would like to ask two questions as well to Dr. Amoruso. Dr. Amoruso, indeed, there are certain issues that relate to Rawabi and Ramallah, whereby they want to stunt kind of the West Bank in the form of the two cities, dwarf them. Sometimes checkpoints are closed, and certain Palestinians do use the fourth, but nowadays all the crossings are closed, and Ramallah is the only city available. And as you know, the Jordanian bridge is closed, and it's been said that there are 25,000 flats in Ramallah are available for the Palestinians to buy as a safe haven if they were forcibly displaced from different parts. The sea area is being pressurized. Expansion of settlements is afoot, and villagers are kind of immigrating from the rural areas into Ramallah as well. So perhaps the Palestinians will be concentrated in Ramallah in order to evacuate the sea areas and the villages, and I think that the sea area is a target that has been focused upon by Israel. The Israeli settlers say that Nablus is more important than Haifa. Hebron is more important than Jaffa. Dr. Dana, I have another question. There is a desire on the part of the NGOs, the international NGOs, to categorize the Israeli practices as being apartheid. The Palestinians thought of that as a victory because the international community dared to say so. You thought that the apartheid categorization is problematic, so how can you explain to us having perhaps two populations with two different sets of legislations and huge differences between the two?
Francesco, do you want to go first?
You go.
I don't mind.
Okay.
Do you want me to? Yeah, I'll go first.
Yeah, because she asked you first.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like I didn't want to make a presentation about Rawabi. I guess I should have, but I was really just trying to extrapolate some different points. Yes, of course, I think Rawabi does buy into that kind of logic of ghettoizing Palestinians inside urban spaces. Absolutely, it is a product of that. It doesn't challenge it. It doesn't change it. So in that sense, it's not so exceptional, right? Yeah. It isn't. I wanted to say something about the questions by a friend from Birzeit, but I think you're there. Okay, great. Yeah, Rawabi is abnormal in so many different ways. I agree with you, but the point is, who has the power to define what's normal and what's abnormal, and who has the power to create a new normality, right? So I agree with you, Rawabi, and this is the impression I had the first time I went, and every single person I know, friends who, just kind of driving, they suddenly see this. By the way, there was supposed to be pictures, but then we forgot, for those who've never seen it. It is absolutely abnormal. Visually, conceptually, all of it. And it's exclusionary as well, right? It's meant for a very, very specific part of the population. But again, yes, the question is, who can create normality? Who does that? And how do you make sure that if a new normal is created, then it's a normal that is just and equitable and so on and so forth. On the issue that is an economic project and not a political project, I don't personally think there's a difference necessarily. I think all economic projects are political. And I think that because it's political that it was allowed to happen, right? If it was truly a kind of like a national, economic sovereignty type of project, they would have had problems. But because politically it reproduces a certain status quo, then that's why I think it was permitted. So it's the political side of it that makes it acceptable. I mean, I even kind of, I've had this in my, I can share an anecdote from my fieldwork. Once I was driving from Ramallah to Tel Aviv to pick someone up at the airport, and I took a wrong turn, and instead of going through Rantis checkpoint, which is kind of like an easy checkpoint, I took the wrong turn and I went through the Modi'in checkpoint, which is manned by a private security firm, and they're the real pain in the neck. And so I had to go through scanners and metal detectors and stuff, and this soldier asks me, "Where are you coming from?" And I was driving from Ramallah, but then I thought, oh, if I say Ramallah, then they're going to be like, oh, what are you doing there? How do you know? Who do you know in Ramallah, and so on and so forth. A lot of questioning and stuff. So I just said, from Rawabi. And she just smiled at me. She was like, oh, is it the new Arab city? Oh, that's amazing. Were you shopping? Did you go shopping there? How's the mall? I heard great things about it. So that's the political kind of acceptance. You know, it's a small kind of anecdote, and it doesn't represent what every single Israeli thinks. But the way Rawabi is portrayed in the Israeli media is absolutely, for the most part, positive, right? So that's yeah.
Dr. Dana.
يا شكرا دكتورة آية. اسمحي لي أرد عليك في الإنجليزي عشان بس أكون دقيقة يعني بالرد. So if I understood your question correctly, essentially what you're saying is that how has this kind of apartheid term proliferated, and how do I have an issue with the term given kind of the realities on the ground? And just to be clear, I don't think apartheid is an incorrect classification necessarily, but the reality is that stopping at the term apartheid and saying, okay, apartheid, so we want an extension of full rights within the current existing state, perpetuates a lot of problems and is not enough. So the fact that now we have Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch saying it's apartheid, I mean, fine, but it's been apartheid, and it's always they're recognizing something kind of quite late or after the fact. And I would argue since its inception, it's been some forms of apartheid. The problem is, basically انك توقف على كلمة apartheid, to stop at the term apartheid. It doesn't give a political, long-term political solution or some sort of program that people can pursue to its logical conclusion. So if you only speak about it in these terms, the logical conclusion is, okay, well, then give everyone rights. That doesn't address the impacts of, over 100 years of colonialism, and it doesn't address future issues that will arise in this kind of hodgepodge state. So that was my critique. I don't know if I clarified or if I understood the question correctly, perhaps.
Thank you, Dr. Dana. Since we're done with questions, يعني أعتقد بأنه هلا نختتم أعمال الجلسة الثالثة من اليوم الثالث من فعاليات.
The session is adjourned. Thank you very much, and I'll see you after lunch.